Welcome to the Osher Institute of Lifelong Learning. I'm glad you all could come. We have an interesting program today, and this program is meant to honor belatedly the service of a group of flyers who served in World War II. World War II generation has been called the Great Generation, and the Tuskegee Airmen were some of the greatest of the great of that generation, certainly among the most noble. And here we are 6 decades later, in effect trying to mitigate some of the stain of those days that was part of the heroism that all went into World War II in that generation. In March of this year, in 2007, in the Capitol Rotunda in Washington, some 300 men of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen received probably the highest honor this country can afford, which is the Congressional Gold Medal. And this took place in the Rotunda of the Capitol building, and our speaker today, Robert Maxwell, was one of those honored with the Congressional Gold Medal. Mr. Maxwell has an interesting background. He is still president of Bob Maxwell and Associates, a technical consulting company. He was a B-25 pilot in the Tuskegee Airmen in what was called, as you all remember, the Army Air Corps in World War II. And he, in civilian life, has had a distinguished record as well. Mr. Maxwell received, after the war, his bachelor's degree in engineering from the City College, now called the City University of New York. He has 2 master's degrees, one from the Stevens Institute of Technology and a master in business administration from UCLA. He is a propulsion systems engineer in the aerospace industry, if you all know what that means. And he's been director of system engineering for the U.S. Department of Transportation. He was transportation manager in the Office of Technical Assessment of the U.S. Congress, and he was a representative of General Electric Company in the Federal Aviation Administration. Mr. Maxwell moved to San Diego in 1987, and at some time thereafter there was organized a group of Tuskegee Airmen San Diego chapter, and he is the president of that group. It's called the B.O. Davis Jr. chapter of the Tuskegee Airmen, General B.O. Davis being the commander of the Tuskegee Airmen. Currently, Mr. Maxwell is on the board of directors of the San Diego Air and Space Museum. He has taught at UCSD for a number of years in the extension. He taught a course in transportation, and he taught a course in entrepreneurship. He's had his own business. He was in the printing business for a while in Encinitas, and he was vice president of Superior Engineering and Electronics when he came to San Diego. We are very happy and proud and honored to have with us today Mr. Robert Maxwell, or should I say Lieutenant Robert Maxwell. He said Bob is fine.
Well, I do appreciate the opportunity to talk to you and to tell you a little bit about the Tuskegee Airmen. In my talk today, this is roughly what I'm going to say. I'd like to give you a little bit of a historical perspective first about blacks in the military and blacks in aviation, and then go into how and when was the Tuskegee Army Airfield created that produced this series of pilots, and talk a little bit about the various squadrons and the operational arena that the Tuskegee Airmen served in. And of course, as you know, partly due to the efforts of the Tuskegee Airmen, we were able to get the integration of the armed services, and talk a little bit about that, and then a little bit about the Congressional Gold Medal. And last but not least, our organization, the Tuskegee Airmen Incorporated. Now, my presentation is not going to be too long, and I'm going to, after it, I'm certainly be pleased to answer any questions that you might have. So to start off, a little bit of a historical perspective. There were a few blacks in the forefront of aviation back in the 20s and 30s, but not many. One of them was shown here, Bessie Coleman. She was the first black woman to get a pilot's license, but she had to go to France in order to get it because she couldn't find anybody that would teach her here. But she went over to France and got her license and came back here and had a career in barnstorming. You know, these pilots used to fly around in these old airplanes and do all sorts of stunts. Unfortunately, in one of those stunts, she succumbed. But Bessie Coleman is one of the few prior to the 1940s that were in aviation. And I'd like to talk just a little bit about blacks in the military. Now, contrary to the fact that there weren't many blacks in aviation, African Americans have always served our country, right from the American Revolution on down. In the American Revolution, the Massachusetts militia had black soldiers participating. Of course, in the Civil War, there were over 300,000 African Americans that served in the Civil War, and 10,000 or more that were killed in that war. They tell me that in the Spanish-American War, when Teddy Roosevelt led the charge up Stonewall Hill, there were black soldiers behind him. And of course, in World War I, we had a number of black African Americans who served in the infantry and in service groups in France. Even though blacks served in the military, they served primarily in support functions, service functions. Very few of them were officers. Even the all-black infantry group were commanded by white officers. And this was reflected the social status of the day, separation of the races, segregation and discrimination against not only blacks, but all minorities. And so with that backdrop, we entered into World War II. And one of the questions that sometimes asks, why would blacks serve a nation that would not serve them? And I think at the ceremony that we had on the gold medal, Colin Powell answered that. And he said, because they believed in the Declaration of Independence, and they believed that all men were created equal. And what else was there for them to believe in? Well, let me go on now and talk about the war in Europe in the 1930s. The world was really in a crisis with Hitler and his armies just devastating the European countries and Italy and Japan. We were really, the world, as I say, was in a crisis, and this country began to realize that we weren't going to be able to stay out of it. One of the things they did realize that this war was going to be fought not only on the ground, but in the air. And that was going to be very important. And they started what they called a civilian pilot training program in 1940. The idea would be to train pilots so that they could serve as instructors and also form a nucleus for pilots that would be trained for the military. And that's how Tuskegee Institute got involved. They were one of the 30-odd universities and colleges throughout the country that had a civilian pilot training program, and they started training pilots down there at Tuskegee, Alabama in 1941. Now, as the war really heated up, I mean, we hadn't Pearl Harbor, December 41, but prior to Pearl Harbor, it was obvious we were going to be involved in this war, and we needed every possible able-bodied man. At that time, when the War Department was trying to get every able-bodied man into service, they still wouldn't train blacks as pilots because they would have to be trained along with white soldiers. But there were lots of pressure on them from the various groups, the various African-American newspapers, and just a lot of people that said, well, now is the time we should break down that tradition. So the War Department had a dilemma. You know, what should they do? And they solved this dilemma by deciding to set up a Tuskegee Army airfield just to train black pilots, a separate but equal facility just to train black pilots. Now, Walter White, who was the chairman of the NAACP, fired off a telegram to the War Department saying, we oppose this. This is just a continuation of segregation, and we oppose it. But the War Department had made up their mind. They built an entire Army Air Corps base at Tuskegee, Alabama, just to train black pilots. Now, when they started training pilots in 1941, one of the people that was fortunately on the scene was a young man by the name of Benjamin O. Davis, Jr. Now, Ben Davis's father had been a military man. He had been in the Army, rose from an enlisted man all the way to a general. First black general in the Army, not in the Air Corps, but in the Army, in the Service Corps. And of course, his son was going to be a military man. I don't think Ben Jr. had much to say about it. And in any event, Ben got a commission to the West Point, the military academy, and entered in the military academy. And when he got there, within a couple of days, he found that he was going to be subjected to a lot of pressure. The cadets decided they weren't going to talk to him. And so they didn't talk to him, except in the line of duty. For 4 years, he went through and graduated from West Point, and that didn't discourage him. And it was one of the things that he brought to his subsequent commands, this determination not to give in. He was a commanding officer of the 99th, 332nd, and other groups, retired after 35 years as a 3-star general. And then about 5 years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, Bill Clinton made him a 4-star general. More than any other person, Ben Davis, deserves credit for whatever the Tuskegee Airmen accomplished. Well, now, the first pilots that were trained at Tuskegee were fighter pilots, and they flew the P-40 airplane, which is shown here. This group was activated in 1942, and their initial assignment was to North Africa in April of '43. They flew a number of missions, shot down not many, but a few aircraft, because there weren't many aircraft in the North African theater, but they destroyed many important ground installations. Meanwhile, they continued to train pilots back at Tuskegee, and they started forming additional squadrons. And ultimately, there were 4 squadrons that formed the 332nd Fighter Group. And they flew the P-39, the P-47, and what is shown here is the P-51 aircraft, which they painted with characteristic red tails. Now, the 332nd Fighter Group was based in Italy, And they started operations just about the time in 1944 when the Army Air Corps started this mass bombardment of Germany and Italy and Poland and other countries. It was daylight bombing raids in which they would have 75 or 100 bombers, B-17s and B-24s, fly over and drop bombs, and did a lot of damage to the German war machine. But at the same time, the German Luftwaffe would just come along and pick those bombers off. In April 1944, they lost an average of 12 bombers a day, over 360 bombers and their crews. Well, some of the crews were able to parachute out and were saved, but it was a tremendous price that they were paying for this bombardment. So the Army Air Corps decided to have the fighter groups fly escort missions for these bombers. And one of the groups that was assigned this job was the 332nd, and they flew over 200 bomber missions. And the guys explained this, they'd fly out and meet the bomber group at a certain location, and then they would go up to altitude and fly over the bombers and look for any marauding aircraft and chase them if they came along. So they flew over 200 of these bomber missions, missions over Munich, Berlin, Budapest, Bucharest, and they never lost a bomber to enemy aircraft. And as I like to say, I feel that a lot of that discipline, a lot of that success was due to Benjamin O. Davis Jr. and the discipline that he installed in his group. Now, their war record, pretty impressive. They destroyed or damaged over 136 aircraft in the air, 270 on the ground, a number of barges, boxcars, locomotives, and ammunition dumps, and one destroyer. I may tell you a little bit about that a little bit later. But at any rate, they did set a very excellent record of combat, and they flew a total of 1,500 missions. They sent over 450 pilots overseas. Meanwhile, they were still training pilots back at Tuskegee Army Airfield. There were a total of 992 pilots that were trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield, first as fighter pilots and then as bomber pilots. And I was one of those that was trained as a bomber pilot. But before we leave the accomplishments of the 332nd, unfortunately, as in combat operations, there are fatalities, and there were 66 that were killed in combat operations and another 32 that were prisoners of war. There were a number of outstanding pilots. Of course, all of them were outstanding in some ways, but a couple that really excelled. One was a fellow by the name of Lee Archer, and he shot down 5 German planes, flew over 169 combat missions. He, after the war, served in the military for 25, 30 years, but then became an executive for General Foods and Philip Morris. Another one was a fellow by the name of Roscoe Brown. He was a commander of the 100th Fighter Group, and he was the first to shoot down a German jet. The Germans, towards the end of the war, introduced these jets, the Me-262, and that was going to rule the air. But Roscoe was the first one to shoot down a German jet using a P-51. Then after the war, Roscoe got his degree in education, doctorate in education, and he's currently director of the Center for Urban Education Policy at the City University of New York. Another outstanding pilot was a fellow by the name of Charles McGee. Now, McGee flew not only World War II, but in Korea and in Vietnam. And he flew 409 combat missions, which is more than any other Air Force pilot has ever flown or ever will fly. And I got to know Colonel McGee, and I used to say, you know, what kind of a rabbit's foot do you carry around with you, Charles? You got, you know, 409 combat missions. So these were a couple of the outstanding pilots of the group. I want to move for a moment to talk about the twin-engine pilots in the bomb group. And this is a picture of the B-25, which was one of the most widely used medium bombers in World War II. And this was the airplane that I trained in. I flew the B-25, and it was a great experience flying that airplane. There were over 250 twin-engine pilots trained at Tuskegee, and they were assembling with their crews and whatnot, just ready to go over to the Pacific when the war was over. And some of the guys in my class were disappointed that they didn't get a chance to get in and see some action. Not me, though. I was just as happy that the war was over because I had other things I was going to do. But at any rate, that was a short history of the pilots and the operational groups, and it led, largely due to their efforts, led to the President Truman's executive order, which was issued in 1948, and which established equal treatment for all those in the military, including women. And so we have today, as you know, in our military services, people, young men and women of all races and ethnic and religious background. And the Air Force, as a result, after that order was issued, were among the forefront of instituting that equality practice. I'd like to mention just one other young man who was trained at Tuskegee. He's a fellow by the name of Daniel James, or his nickname was Chappie, shown here. And Chappie was a big guy, as you can probably see. He was about 6'4" and 250 pounds. And some interesting stories about him fitting into the small cockpits of the fighters. But at any rate, Chappie went on after the war in a number of different assignments and became a 4-star general. He was the first 4-star general, black 4-star general in the Army Air Force. He became commander of the North American Air Defense Command. Now, once this line had been broken, it really did serve as an opportunity to young men to get into the military and to go into flying operations. And some of these, what we like to call second generation military, are listed here. A fellow by the name of Lloyd Newton. His nickname was Fig Newton. He became the commander of the Air Force Training Command over all training operations. It's kind of ironic, because before the war, they wouldn't even train pilots, black pilots now. They had a black man who was a commander of all the training operations. We had another fellow by the name of Walter Davis, a vice admiral, who lives here in San Diego. He was commander of the U.S. Ranger Carrier Group 66. He was a commanding officer of Spar Wars. I had Admiral Davis over to talk to some of the kids at a couple of events, and he used to tell them about landing on the carriers. He made over 900 carrier landings, which really strikes me. I mean, I had enough trouble landing on the ground, much less on a carrier. We had Major General Charles Bolden of the Marine Corps, test pilot, who was commander of one of the expeditionary forces, and an astronaut, flew 4 shuttle flights. And a 4-star General Lester Lyles, who was commander of the Air Force Systems Command. Now, that was second generation, but some of the Tuskegee Airmen that went into civilian life. William Coleman, who was the Secretary of Transportation, Coleman Young, someone spoke to me about just earlier today, who was the mayor of Detroit, and others who served in various high-level positions in government and industry. Beyond the Tuskegee Airmen, we believe, demonstrated beyond doubt that black citizens of this country could perform as combat fighter pilots, carrying out missions that they were assigned with skill and determination and success. I don't have time to get into it today, but they were not willing to accept the status quo of blacks in America. And many of their actions helped the civil rights movement of the 60s and led to not only to the integration of the armed services, but a significant contribution to the civil rights movement. There is a statue at the Air Force Academy, and on that statue are these words: "They rose from adversity through courage, commitment, and capacity to serve America on silver wings, to set a standard few will transcend." Now, just this past year, we had a very distinguished honor bestowed on us. Representative Charlie Rangel and Senator Carl Levin introduced to the Congress a bill which would award the Congressional Gold Medal to the Tuskegee Airmen. This bill was signed last year, actually, but the medal was presented, as you heard in the introduction, on March 29th of this year in a ceremony in the Capitol Rotunda. And it was presented to over 300 of those who participated in the Tuskegee Experience. Now, the Congressional Gold Medal is something that's been awarded over the last couple of hundred years. The first person to get the Congressional Gold Medal was George Washington, and we had a number of other people, both in the military life, in the entertainment fields, in the various fields that had been awarded the Congressional Gold Medal. When they came to us and said, you know, who should we give this medal to? And we said, well, of course, those fighter pilots, the one that risked their lives, and they should get it. But in addition to that, those pilots couldn't have accomplished what they did without the mechanics and the ground crew and the air traffic controllers and the ammunitions people and all the administrative people that go to make up an operational training base and an operational combat base. And so you really ought to give it to everyone that participated. And so they agreed. And we were able to identify about 300 of us that were still alive and still able to travel. And we gathered in the Congress, the Capitol Rotunda, and we had a very great ceremony presided over by President Bush and Nancy Pelosi and all of the leaders of Congress, and Colin Powell was there, and it was just a tremendous experience. My wife and I both went back and participated in it, and we really greatly appreciated the honor that has been bestowed on us. It was kind of interesting. We had over 300 of these original Tuskegee Airmen, and we went around to several of the rooms in the Capitol for various activities, and we'd be jammed in a room, and they'd say, well, now we're going to move over here. And of course, a good number of the Tuskegee Airmen were in wheelchairs, and so they said, well, okay, wheelchairs first. So all the guys with wheelchairs went out, and then, okay, canes next. Everybody with canes would go out, and then the rest of us, you know, limped along. But it was great, and we enjoyed it. I just want to conclude by telling you a little bit about the organization that we formed, we realized that it was important for us to make sure that this history wasn't forgotten. And so we formed a nonprofit 501c3 corporation in 1973. We have 51 chapters nationwide. And our objectives are to foster the recognition and preserve the achievements of blacks in aviation, but more important, to inspire and motivate young men and women towards careers in aviation, aerospace, and other technical fields, and really to help to hopefully inspire them to prepare themselves and go after what they're interested in. And so we do a lot of talking to various schools and boys and girls clubs and other groups. And that's our mission, to try to reach out to the young people today and make sure they realize how important it is for them to work toward a goal. So our organization is open to anyone who shares our objectives. If any of you would like to join us, we'd be delighted to have you. We have, our national organization has a web page, www.tuskegeeairmen.org. And, I need to mention the scholarship program. The national organization awards 45 scholarships every year to high school seniors. And our chapter in San Diego offers additional assistance awards. So and I have to, as a good reminder, we gratefully accept donations to our scholarship fund. And so here's how you can reach us. I'm the president of the chapter. We have a web page here in San Diego, Tuskegee Airmen, sandiego.org, or you can reach me at my email or telephone address. So with that, I'd like to conclude my prepared remarks, and after a short break, take any questions that you might have. Thank you very much.
How much educational background was required at that time that you signed up, and how much did you have?
How much education is required to sign up for pilot training? I guess you what? High school education was all that was required. I happened to have a little bit more than that. I had actually finished college and I had my engineering degree. And so that helped me along a little bit, got me through ground school, maybe a little easier than the other guys. But a number of the guys are right out of high school. A friend of mine was telling me that he graduated from high school one day and he was in the Army the next day. And within a year, he was flying 51s over in Europe. Yes.
Mr. Maxwell, I don't have a question, but I have an observation that I made a number of years back when I first met you. And I'm a retired naval aviator, sir. And my response and reaction then was the same one I'm having again today. That is, how have I waited so long to have such a vital, integral part of my background filled in by you? I made a comment to a gentleman sitting right next to me. I said, you know, in my opinion, he is a very transparent and humble man. And that's my appraisal, and I thank you, sir, for letting me in again.
Well, thank you for your comments. Appreciate it. Yes, sir.
A much simpler question. How did you navigate to these cities? What navigational aids were available? Or when you left England, you didn't just head in the direction of Budapest and hope it was there, did you?
Yes, that's right. And the Germans didn't help us out any by providing any navigational aids. There weren't any, air traffic controllers directing the guys. So it was pretty much navigation by, what they used to call it, pilotage, by navigating from one landmark to another. and hoping that what you saw on your maps was what was down below.
But what about if there was cloud cover? Weren't you above the clouds a lot of the time?
Up in the cloud, yes, yes. Well, you had to. Part of our training was instrument flying, and so we were taught how to fly through the clouds if necessary, and make instrument landings, even though we didn't have any sophisticated landing systems. There was still some rudimentary, at least in this country, there was some rudimentary, navigation systems. Over in Europe, they were pretty much on their own, and so it was, you really had to know where you were and where you were going to be able to get back safely. Thank you for that question. Yes?
Lieutenant Maxwell, the Tuskegee Airmen amassed such a stellar record of achievement there in combat. To what extent do you feel that you all were motivated by this extra need to excel and to prove yourselves as Black Americans?
Well, there was no question that we were motivated. We understood that, here was an opportunity for us to show what we could do. And if we were successful, it had to help the overall fight for equality. So we did understand that, and we worked hard to make sure that we were as capable as could be. Of course, we never had any idea that the success would be something that would follow us later in years. But we did realize its importance when we were going through the training. Thank you for that question. Yes, sir.
Just two factual questions. First, Alagaroo. I'm a City College boy myself.
Alagaroo, gura.
And
good to see you.
So the first question is, when did you get out of City College? And the second question is, I was in the 15th Air Force in Italy. Where were the Tuskegee men based in Italy?
Well, I'll answer the second part. They were based in Ramatelli, Italy, and I'm not sure exactly how to describe where that is, but it's in the southern part of Italy.
Do you know where it was related to Foggia?
I beg your pardon?
Do you know where it was related to Foggia?
I heard that name, so it was nearby Foggia. In fact, I think there were some Air Corps units assigned at Foggia, but it was in that area. And then, your other part of your question, you wanted to know when I graduated from City. 1948.
48. Okay, I'm class of 42.
I'm sorry. Let me correct myself. I graduated in 1942 from City College.
We might have been classmates.
We were probably. Well, we'll have to talk about this.
Were you there when the first girl was admitted?
No, I don't remember that. Well, maybe I do. But anyway, 42, and I was in School of Technology. I was in engineering, so I got my mechanical engineering degree. And since you brought up City College, Colin Powell was part of the ceremony at the gold medal ceremony. And after the ceremony, I went up to him, introduced myself, and I said, I'm a City College grad too. And he said, oh, isn't that great? And he says, City College was a great experience. And I agreed with him. And he said, you know what, they have named a building for me on the City University campus after me. And he says, I was so proud of that. And so I had a chance to talk to him a little bit about it. And City College was unusual because, first of all, it was a free college. And so all of us poor kids who couldn't afford to go to other colleges, we got in and we got a college education. At one time it was called, and it was a very good education, very high standards. At one time it was called the poor man's Harvard. So we have to talk about City College.
I went to City College also.
Oh, great. Well,
But I didn't graduate from there. My question is, when the movie Tuskegee Airmen came out, how did you and your comrades feel about that movie?
That's a good question, and we get asked that quite often. Well, first of all, the overall impact of that movie was tremendous, because a lot of people saw it, and the first time they realized that, some of the things that happened. Now, Hollywood did a good job of dramatizing it, and it turned out to be a very interesting movie to watch. Most of it was true, and the reason was one of the fighter pilots in the 332nd, Bob Williams, after the war, he thought that telling the story of the Tuskegee Airmen would make a good movie, and so he wrote a script. And for about 10 years, he tried to get somebody interested in producing this script. Couldn't get anybody interested in it, but finally HBO said that they were going to do it. They brought Bob Williams on as a consultant, took his script, and then elaborated on it. So most of the incidents in that movie actually did occur, and they were told by Bob Williams, who was one of the Tuskegee fighter pilots.
The airmen who were shot down and became prisoners of war, did they have anything to recount about their experiences different from white airmen who were shot down?
Mm-hmm. Well, yes, several of them did tell about some of their experiences. By and far, they felt that they were treated probably like most other prisoners of war, which was not good, but they weren't discriminated against as far as they knew. And so they were able to survive, and there were some 30-odd prisoners of war. One of the fellows who was at the ceremony was a prisoner of war, and he told a little bit about his experiences. There is another little story here about after the war. Then the prisoners were put on ships to come back to the United States, and not only the black prisoners but the white American prisoners, and so they were on board ship, and everybody was very friendly and whatnot, and no racial barriers on board ship. When they got into the harbor and they got off the ship, and they saw a sign said white soldiers this way, colored soldiers this way. Same old stuff.
One of the best things that happened to the people that served in the Second World War was the GI Bill. And obviously, people who could be a high school student one day, then be going to flight training the next, were obviously first quality people, and they had a successful service in the military. Do you have any idea how many of the Tuskegee Airmen took advantage of the GI Bill and got their college degrees? Do you know that they did it at a rate more or less than pilots from the Navy or from the Army?
I can't give you an exact number, but I can tell you that there were many who did take advantage of it. And even though I had my bachelor's degree, I got my master's degree and my MBA, both on the GI Bill. And it was something that, but it was something that a lot of Tuskegee Airmen, as well as a lot of other veterans, did take advantage of. And we were talking about that recently, that it's a shame that we don't have such a procedure now for the veterans that are coming back, to guarantee them some way to continue their education. Thank you.
You had mentioned that at the ceremony in Washington, out of the 300 folks that were awarded, many of them were the ground crew type of folks. Were the ground crews for the Tuskegee Airmen, did they have to be black, or were they white as well?
Well, initially, there weren't enough either flying instructors or ground crew, so they were white soldiers were assigned. But then they had a program for training black ground crew men in all of the necessary skills. And so when I got down to Tuskegee in 1944, the entire ground crew and the entire instructor crew were black. So we had an entirely separate, segregated base right from top on down.
Another little question. You mentioned a minute ago, white folks went this way, colored folks went that way. And you mentioned something just now about black airmen. What designation racially did they have in the 40s for you folks? Were you considered black airmen, Negro airmen, color? How did they designate you color-wise in those years?
Well, the term that was mostly in use was Negro. You were classified as a Negro. And on my military papers, that's the classification. I was looking at it the other day, and discharge papers, and there was no question about it. You were Negro, or the term black hadn't really come into being at that time. But right from the time that you went into the military and went to the reception center, you were immediately segregated and stayed that way throughout the service. Yes?
Two questions. One, what remains today of Tuskegee Army Airfield? And two,
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that.
What remains today of that airfield?
Oh, of the airfield?
Yes.
It was completely dismantled. In fact, when I left there in June of 1946, we closed it down. It's an open field. There's nothing left.
Nothing has been built on that property either?
No. Now, at Tuskegee Institute, which is now Tuskegee University, which is about 5 miles away from the air base, that's still in existence, Tuskegee University, and the field, that primary field where we trained in the Stearmans, that field has been preserved, and the National Park Service is building a memorial to the Tuskegee Airmen on Moton Field, as it's called.
I think also there's a very nice gallery section at the 8th Army Museum in Savannah on the history of the Tuskegee Airmen. My other question related to what was asked just earlier. You were asked whether or not there were ground crew who were white. And my question relates to those who initially trained you at Tuskegee. I assume they were white, and was that considered to be good duty on their part? Were they reluctant, or did you have any difficulties with them?
Well, I think, no, I don't think we had any difficulties. I think they looked at it as an assignment and they carried it out. And of course, I did say that by the time I got down to Tuskegee, it was almost an entirely black operation. But the commanding officer, Colonel Parrish, was a white man, and he was an outstanding leader. He was very fair, and we had, everyone thought that he bent over backward to try to make sure that we got the right training and that we didn't have any problems. And so we, every year we have an award, the Colonel Parrish Award, in his memory.
I went to college in the late 40s when all the veterans were returning, and a friend I made there, an African American, he related that he had been a pilot during the war. And so my question was, were all African American pilots, were they trained at Tuskegee, or were there other sources of, was he a Tuskegee Airman? They didn't used to go into that kind of detail.
Well, at that time, until 1948, any pilot that was trained in the Army Air Corps was, either trained at Tuskegee Army Airfield or was trained with one of the operational black units.
So I could look him up on your webpage or something and find out.
Yes.
If he did.
Yes, and in fact, there was a fellow who undertook to record the names of all of the people all of the soldiers that participated. And before he passed, he was able to get somebody to put that on a computer. And there's a CD that you can get that has listed all of the names of the Tuskegee Airmen pilots as well as ground crew. And that formed a base for when they said, who are you going to give that medal to? We referred to that database. And so we can probably track him down if you knew his name.
I do know his name. Maybe you know him. In Northern California, James Goodwin. Do you know him? James Goodwin was his name?
The name is familiar. I didn't.
My other question is, now when somebody graduated and became a pilot, they became officers.
Yes.
What was the impact of there being this group of black airmen on relations within the Army and in the communities where they work? Well,
okay, you bring up a very interesting situation. The bomber group that was being formed, the 477 bomber group, one of the bases that they were training at was Freeman Field, which was in Indiana. And so we had a couple of hundred, well, maybe 100, 150 black pilots stationed at Freeman Field. And there was one officers' club at Freeman Field, but they couldn't enter that officers' club. So that really was a challenge to them at that time. And they were strategizing, what to do. And some of the wiser men said, look, if you take an active opposition to this, well, you could be cited under the rules of war, articles of war. So you can't do anything violent. So they decided to have a nonviolent approach. And they took 2 or 3 guys at a time would go up to the door of the officers' club and try to enter, and they were turned back. And then another group would come up, and another group would come up, So the idea was we'd wear them down. One guy got a little overambitious, and when the guy said he couldn't enter, he brushed on by him, and a guard caught him and court-martialed him. And that led to court-martialing the entire group of officers at that base for not obeying Army restrictions. Ultimately, the Army realized that that was a mistake, and they pardoned, or they dropped that. But this particular guy, it was on his record that he had been court-martialed, and I don't know whether he was discharged or not, but. And then about 10 years or so ago, somebody decided that they would try to get that removed from his record, and they were able to do it. And so we had a big celebration because he was exonerated from his. He's still alive, yeah, lives up in LA. But that was just one incident. It was after the war, these men were stationed in a number of different places. And of course, one of the big problems was where do you live? Where do you bring your family? And there wasn't any housing. So that there were a number of problems associated with that persisted up until the 60s and beyond. Thanks for that question.
You mentioned Bessie Coleman as the first black woman aviator, and I just wondered, and that she was before World War II. Was there any thought at any time of admitting women to train at Tuskegee?
Not as pilots. I guess the Army Air Corps hadn't quite got to that point yet. So the answer to your question is no, there weren't any black women as pilots. Now, we did have nurse corps there, and women in other occupations, but not as pilots. And of course, this, after the war, a number of the fellows tried to get jobs as pilots with the commercial airlines without success. And it wasn't until the mid-50s that the airlines started admitting blacks as pilots. And so today there are several hundred black pilots, a number of captains flying in for the airlines. A little story about that. We have, every year we have a convention, and one year, 5 or 6 years ago, I met this young lady who was a flight attendant, and she was telling me that, she'd really like to learn to fly. And so I said, well, why don't you go ahead? And so a couple of years later, I met her again at the convention. She was wearing wings, and she had been put on as a first officer on one of the airlines. And she was saying, well, I was watching these guys when I was a flight attendant. I was watching them. And she said, that's something I could do. And so she did. And today we have, I don't know, a dozen or so African-American women, black women, who are pilots for the airlines, and a couple who are captains. So we've made some progress, but there's still some progress to be made. Appreciate it. Thank you.